So, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation to Ku-ring-gai Council and James and staff, and the opportunity to talk to you good people who live in the wonderful leafy suburbs of the Upper North Shore area, which is obviously a lovely place to live, but an area which is significantly bushfire prone. And of course, that's the problem. We love to be in amongst the bush, yet we have to recognize that this is a problem on those high and extreme bushfire days, which have become more frequent and more intense. I live and work at Katoomba, top end of the mountain, so the last, 30 odd years. This is my timber studio, which won an award 20 years ago for using recycled, repurposed materials all the way through to demonstrate sustainable design and construction. I won't bother trying to run through that today, but I make the point that now I would not be allowed to build it in timber or in that location because it's above a steep southern slope. 20 years ago, the thought was, well, the southern slope, that's minor. It's the least likely direction that bushfires will come from, shouldn't be a problem. However, we're now that little bit older and wiser, and we realize that under the drying out of our landscapes, the soil moisture changes, the increasing temperatures, that unfortunately, anywhere and everywhere which is officially bushfire prone is highly subject to fire. And one of the interesting things, James, that I heard at the conference a couple of weeks ago was that the first research on the black summer bushfires and the loss of 2,500 buildings, or homes rather, in New South Wales, was that 13% of the losses weren't even officially in bushfire affected areas. And that's because of the nature of these fires. But I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Well, Blue Mountains is the most bushfire prone area, local government anywhere, at 73–74%. But I remember reading that Ku-ring-gai was something like 38–39%, second or third most bushfire prone local government area. And of course, you've had your local fires shooting up gullies. You've had your experience last year, when was it, November, December, when everyone watching the news could see the tankers dropping pink fire retardant over your streets, cars, buildings, and of course to minimize and hopefully reduce the flame threat and the direction of the bushfire. Because those big tankers, I just realized only recently, they can lay a trail 30 meters wide and over 1 kilometer long of fire retardant. That's the super tankers, which Australia, of course, is now looking at getting additional fire protection from them. Because as I'm sure you will appreciate from the bushfires last season, the RFS and all the emergency services people do not stand in the front of the fire, the approaching fire. They have to work around the edges. They have to work increasingly from the air to try and slow and divert. They can't actually stop the severity of the fires that we now are experiencing, unfortunately, widespread over the eastern states, Kangaroo Island, Tasmania a year earlier, when the World Heritage rainforest, not burnt in 1,000 years, had major fires going all the way through that area. We're in a different position to we've ever been before. So, you've probably heard of the Fire Danger Index. It's to do with the prediction of what is going to come. And for the first time ever in the middle of November last year, you may recall, our state government decided that because of the drought, because of the extreme soil dryness, that meant that the vegetation was, to use the term, cured and ready to ignite. So for the first time ever, they declared an extreme or catastrophic fire day in advance of the fire. And if you remember, they closed schools and preschools and the like, many businesses, to stop the likelihood of people being trapped. They wanted people to remain at home to be able to deal with the fire risk in their own way. So we always need to look out for the FDI. It's a prediction: temperature, humidity, wind speed, dryness, likelihood of fire and lightning. Because some of you might have been following the awful fires in California in the last few weeks and months, and they're going through pretty much what we have this time round in their summer season. But they're getting fires more intense than ever before their official fire season, just like we did last year. So it's a worry. We have to look out very carefully for our fire risk. We need to look at official warnings, and particularly on those extreme and catastrophic days, have to be super well prepared, hopefully with your emergency or fire action plan. Now, I've already said the risk is growing. This chart from Bureau of Meteorology looks at the annual mean temperature across Australia as a whole, some areas greater than others, of course. But it shows that from around about 1970, you can see the trend is absolutely going up. And that is not likely to change in our lifetimes. It's to do with climate change, it's to do with global warming. There are a whole series of unstoppable events happening unless we all do something about it now in a community, politically wise way. And even if we do, it's not going to get better before it gets worse. So we need to be conscious of what our risk is and ideally do something about it. So officially, when Australian Standard 3959 is being applied, that's the major bushfire standard, which is called up in all building regulations and planning regulations around Australia. And that document basically deals with the closeness to bushland. How close is the property, the house, the edge of the house, the wall, how close is that to managed or unmanaged vegetation? Because there's many types of vegetation. In the official standard, there's 26. Queensland have found in their state, they've got 119 different kinds of vegetation, some of which are far more bushfire prone than others. So that information is known. It's more than perhaps you and I want to know about, but the key point is that native vegetation is adapted for our climate. And as we're getting warmer weather, as we're getting extreme dryness, that's when the vegetation is ready to ignite. And of course, it's a point of extreme winds, erratic winds, and an ignition source that causes them to run and very quickly are unstoppable. So the other aspect is the slope of land under the vegetation, because when your land is flat, or if you're living on the flatter part, that means a fire will travel at whatever speed, depending on the amount of fuel. But the moment you start to rise on the slope of the land, it quickly doubles and trebles or quadruples in speed and intensity. So the slope of land under the particular vegetation, that's a key point that you need to look at. Are you living near a bushland gully? What kind of bush? Is it rocky, or is it really lots of low shrubs and tall trees? Have a think about that, because obviously rocks aren't going to burn. They could help you from radiant heat, but it's the point of the vegetation at ground level, and will the vegetation, the nature of the vegetation, carry the fire up into the tree canopy? What we tend to see on the media is, of course, a highly dramatic canopy fire with, flames shooting 20, 30 meters or more into the sky. But that's a real risk. The radiant heat is the killer for us humans, and unfortunately for animals too. But often that might shoot ahead, and then there is a secondary fire front coming through at ground level, very intense. And that is the only part that normally us humans can do anything to control or divert or reduce. So the key point, we are going to have more fires. We need to be aware of the growing intensity, And those points are the official hub indicators of what your bushfire risk might be. So, as was said at the Royal Commission recently, there's close to 10% of Australian houses are bushfire prone in high or extreme situations. That means up to 1 million people in my local government area and yours. So it's sensible, if we can possibly do it, and happily Ku-ring-gai Council is giving financial assistance, I'll talk about at the end, to retrofit in small but important ways to make your home safer. Because we need to be prepared in advance. The last minute decisions, the emergency decisions as the fire comes, are usually not the good ones. So why don't we do it? We've all got our reasons, we've all got our excuses, one might say. And of course, the most common thing is, it won't happen to me. Because we all like to believe that it's awful where it has happened, but what's the likelihood? What's the chance? Well, unfortunately, in your local government area and mine, we have a higher likelihood than almost anywhere else in Australia of a fire coming through our region. This is my excuse. I'm so busy, I don't quite get around to it. Time, lack of time. So now is the time in the next few weeks or months to really put the time aside and do those necessary housekeeping bushfire retrofit issues, which we'll get into in a few moments. Again, another common one, I need to prioritize family or my work obligations or weekend sport. Yep, all very important, but I strongly suggest in bushfire prone areas, we need to actually be really, really well prepared. And this is an unfortunate one that is too common in our country these days. Instead of taking personal responsibility for our own property, the attitude has grown that it's up to council or the RFS, emergency services, to make my area safer. So it's buck passing, not good enough. And of course, I'm sure you've heard the RFS say, the leadership say very clearly, we cannot and will not be able to put a fire tanker in front of every property when a fire comes through. It's just not possible. So again, some states, some jurisdictions specifically state in regulations that it is a joint responsibility. It's not that just of the emergency services or local government. So we need to take personal responsibility for our property. And another one is the belief that, well, if we burn down, how unfortunate, but insurance will cover us. Now, this is something that in this last 6 months has really started to be rethought again, because is it a false hope? Think about it. Insurance is meant to be there to cover the unlikely event, the unpredictable event. But bushfires are starting to become predictable. Mapping is starting to show the areas of high or extreme bushfire risk. Until recently, bushfire claims, the dollars that insurance companies pay out, only averaged 12% of all the payouts. Storm, flood, tempest, they were the big ones. Bushfire, until the last season, was only 12% of insurance payout. That, of course, is now significantly increased and is probably going to increase more. So, think about it. If we look at the areas which are, for example, in flood-prone areas, which is in many ways easier to map than bushfire, people are finding that it might cost them $20,000 to $30,000 per annum to insure their property if they can get insurance. Because some of the insurance companies are now saying, you move to the problem. You're living in a known area where there is an emergency, where there is a problem, we won't insure you. So we haven't quite got there yet, but when the research comes in more fully regarding the loss of buildings in the Black Summer fires, we're going to find there's many more discussions on insurance, the cost? Is it available? Is it the premium related to the BAL rating that we have, the postcode that we share? We don't yet know. But I assure you, from the Royal Commission, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action discussions, and elsewhere, all of this is being discussed. And let me just give you one example from here in the mountains. A client of mine, they got this letter a few years ago now, get your home ready for bushfire season. And it said, did you know, with some useful advice. And then, by means that they don't state, it told this homeowner, that we certainly know is in higher extreme bushfire, they're saying, we suggest your property is BAL rating 68.8. That, of course, is off the chart. That is more than just into flame zone. So we don't know how they got that number. We don't know what they meant by sending that letter. In that, certainly the homeowner rang me up immediately and said, what can we do? We're running this huge risk. And obviously they wanted to know from the insurance company, what are you saying? Are you saying that we have to retrofit? Are you saying that you won't insure us? Are you giving a warning that if we were to lose our property, that because of BAL 68.8 and we didn't do something, you may or may not pay? We don't know. It was left hanging. But that's not good enough, really, every day. If you've got a property which you care about and you want your property to be rebuilt if the worst should happen and you were to lose it. And bear in mind that different states pay for the equivalent of RFS, Rural Fire Service, differently, but in New South Wales, it is actually the insurance companies that are the major financial contributor towards running of the RFS. Other states do it differently. So you can well see that there is a tie-up between insurance payout and what the RFS can and cannot do when it comes to an emergency. So certainly, most people have no idea what it costs to rebuild if they lose their property. Same company, AAMI Insurance, has provided several years ago this chart, which says the additional cost from a standard project home, if it's BAL 12.5 to 40, $16,000 to $56,000. Not cheap. BAL 40, $19,000 to $73,000 or more. That's starting to be noticeable. But look at flame zone. If you are within probably 20, 30, 40, 50 meters of eucalyptus forest, reasonably dense woodland, you are possibly heading towards BAL flame zone, and you might be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars more if and when you have to totally rebuild. We hope you don't have to, but this is the point where so many people after bushfires discover if they've got insurance, they can't afford to rebuild what they had because they were significantly underinsured by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So just be aware, insurance is going to become an increasing issue, why retrofit is needed and why we can't expect to build inexpensively anymore in higher extreme bushfire areas. So there's a few official documents around. This is the Country Fire Authority in Victoria. The New South Wales RFS has a couple of pages called Upgrading of Existing Buildings that's available on site. And there's various other documents here that I have in front of me, but I'm making it simple for you. I'm just giving you some ideas about some of the key points because I'm assuming that we all start with what's the low-hanging fruit? What's low cost but is effective? As distinct from moderate, or some of you perhaps can afford the expensive rebuilding costs or the significant change to fabric, but many of us can't. So let's just run through what are the major issues and talk about low, moderate and higher cost options that you might want to consider, and then talk to James and Ku-ring-gai Council a bit later about which way do you want to go if you're going to apply for a grant. So I'm sure you realize that these are the main issues to do with bushfire. What people don't realize is that it's ember attack that knocks out 80 to 90% of buildings. At the Bushfire conference a few weeks ago, the latest research said 92% of all losses was recorded due to ember attack. They're the firebrands. They're the leaves that are aflame. They're the twigs that can travel kilometers ahead of the fire front, or even to one side when the local fire weather is changed by the firestorm conditions that we saw in the Black Summer recent times. So the burning embers fly through the air, they land on something. Will it burn? Will it start to ignite? Will it fester and then reach a point where it's unstoppable? And remember that as the RFS and other emergency services encourage us to leave before the fire front comes through, that's great for public safety, but the consequence is we'll probably lose more buildings because the embers, there's no one there to put them out necessarily. So ember attack is one of the first and most critical things to do when it comes to upgrading your home. Second one, radiant heat. Now the BAL rating, bushfire attack level, that is the index that was brought in a decade or more ago, and that looks at the radiant heat per square meter. So if we're talking about BAL 19, that's 19 kilowatts of radiant heat per square meter coming straight at your house, your property. So BAL 12.5, BAL 19, BAL 29. Up to BAL 29, most common building materials are reasonably durable, are reasonably able to withstand up to BAL 29. It's the BAL 40 and flame zone that becomes the expensive issue, as I've said. Direct flame, well, that depends on the nature of the vegetation, your garden, what's close to the house. Because bear in mind that when you have a slope and the fire comes up the slope, the flame length is longer. It's preheating the foliage, the materials ahead of it. It's preheating, ready to ignite and speed up and become more intense. So if you're living on top of a hill or a ridge top, inherently, you are going to be at a far greater bushfire risk than if you are building low down or in a gully or a valley floor. So bear that in mind. Now the other aspect is of course extreme winds, because we've seen documented very well in this last bushfire season the way weather is created by bushfire. Most bushfires in Australia, and in fact California, comes from lightning strikes. Lightning strike on dry vegetation well away from where people are. Yes, there's arson. Typically, that's a very small percentage compared to the 80 or 90%, which can be lightning strikes in distant areas. And that's why part of the New South Wales bushfire inquiry, and I'm sure coming up in the Royal Commission findings, the whole point of trying to tackle fires early, this point of early warning, early intervention, get in there in the first hour, because maybe in 10 or 15 hours at that point, you can do nothing to stop it. You can only work around the edges. Extreme winds, an increasing problem, because high winds are created by this vortex of heat. And winds, of course, can perhaps, if your window glass is cracked, standard glass, been around for 20, 30, 40 years, if that cracks because of the heat or flying debris, then the wind might suck it out. The wind might then remove the glass or even remove part of your roof if you haven't got it well tied down. So extreme winds are not something that they can easily measure when it comes to house losses, but it's well known, it's a fundamental fact. And the last one, which is acknowledged, and again, it's more to do with damage, is that of smoke, because smoke is very pervasive. If you've got gaps and cracks, and even if your house has not been directly affected by the fire front, you can still get smoke damage. Carpets, soft furnishings, curtains, your own clothes, things that are not so necessarily so easy to replace, and insurance probably doesn't want to know, unfortunately. So bear that in mind. Embers, absolutely number one. Heat and flame and extreme winds. So let's be practical. Let's just run through on some of these slides some of the key points that can guide you in thinking about your own property and what you could and should be doing passively to reduce your bushfire risk. And when we say passive systems, I'm referring to things that you build in, things that defenses that you can control, whether you're there or not, compared to other ways. And of course, it's the native eucalypt, it's the leaf litter, as it's called, it's the bark. It's all these wonderful ecological processes that really is fantastic for nature until the fire comes and it's consumed by the flame. And of course, the whole point about rough bark trees compared to smooth bark trees, because if you've got a fire at ground level, they don't want it carried up the trunk into the canopy. So you perhaps might be aware that if you were building new, for example, the RFS would insist, if you're in a higher extreme bushfire area, that the tree canopies are to be separated. You don't have a continuous canopy across your property to the house. Similarly, you must not have trees overhanging the eave of your home. We'll come more to that in a moment. And of course, the idea of having brush fences, they might look good, but what could trap burning embers more readily than something like that? And a minor ignition becoming unstoppable and spreading all the way along the length of that fence. And certainly, as we build close together, then house-to-house fires is something the Bushfire Conference a few weekends ago was really getting stuck into, because if you've all been evacuated and the next door building's only 2 or 5 meters away, if one building well and truly catches alight, the wind and the flame from one will probably be impinging directly on next door. So, Asset Protection Zone, that's the jargon, the APZ. In a perfect world, the RFS talks about an inner APZ and an outer APZ. What matters is this whole point of what is combustible near your home or your garage, your studio, whatever. It's trying to separate the most combustible construction, the most combustible vegetation, and keeping it 10, 20, 30, 50 meters away. In a perfect world, the RFS would like to keep it 100 meters or more away, because the research is starting to show that if you're within 130 meters of reasonably dense native eucalypt forest or woodland, that's when the houses usually are lost, when there's no one around. So if you're able to fuel reduce, well and good. Now, you probably realize New South Wales has the 10-50 rule. The 10-50 means you can remove trees within 10 meters of your house. You can remove vegetation on your property and only on your property to 50 meters without having to go to the tree protection or tree preservation officer of council. So it's a given right, 10 meters for trees, 50 meters for vegetation, but entirely and only on your own property. If the risk comes from next door, be it a reserve or an unmanaged residential property, then you're stuck. Because yes, there's an official procedure of getting an easement on the adjacent property where if you get what's called a Section 88B easement, then that officially would give you permission to fuel reduce on your neighbour's side if the neighbour is willing to do so. But I don't think many have ever been issued because that would restrict the neighbour, the neighbouring property, their ability to develop or do anything on that area of their land. So it's not really much of an option. The interesting point to me is that for the first time, the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry has raised the prospect of doing fuel reduction, extending asset protection zones along streets or along areas in public land. This is new, because up to now, the attitude has been, it's every property owner for themselves. But because of the new fire risk, they have raised it. They don't have an answer yet, but this is something, again, we will see much discussion in the next 6 months or 2 years about, instead of property by property, people trying to defend and concerned about bushfire, the idea that perhaps on the edge of settlement areas, be it a reserve, be it national park, that's where it could be feasible to fuel reduce and therefore extend the likelihood of property surviving. And of course, that means you and me, people, surviving, and animals, of course, having the chance to escape. And the whole point of this is to manage and reduce the fuel load. What's on the ground, what's close to the ground, and then the whole point about canopy separation. This whole thing of reducing the amount of flammable material close to where we live. And of course, there's many a property lost by having wood mulch, which is terrific for the soil, but not when the fire takes the fire front right up to the house, right up to the property. So increasingly, you could consider using things like gravel rather than actually wood mulch, or paving adjacent to your house. And of course, interestingly, there's a lot of work now to do with landscape design, but I'll come to that in a moment. Because yes, your garden, I'm sure most days of the year, you love it, you protect it, you look after it, you keep adding more suitable plants and perhaps hard landscape features. This property here indicates in the Blue Mountains extreme bushfire risk and some useful pointers in what to do when it comes to a garden, which is also defendable, or the other word they use, defensible space. It means the same thing, defendable, defensible. So on the left and behind in the photograph, you can see the eucalypt vegetation very close. But in this instance, they've used gabions, wire cages, and very nicely stacked rocks. They've done it quite neatly on the outside, and they put any old rubble, broken bricks, whatever you want on the inside. So here they've used it structurally to support a garden canopy. And obviously there's a barbecue, a gas barbecue, and there's a really nice sitting area, and it's open on all four sides. So it's a lovely garden space. And of course, if you're sheltering from radiant heat, if you're firefighting, this is very effective, because we've talked about BAL ratings. Human beings can only withstand perhaps 5 kilowatts per square meter for 20 seconds. We cannot, our bodies cannot take much heat for more than a number of seconds or a minute at the most. So firefighters, of course, have their specialized material suits. They're wearing masks, they're wearing head protection, and they have very little exposed skin for obvious reason that they need more time and more protection, because it's only even a small fire produces enormous radiant heat, and sheltering behind it is pretty important if something comes through and you're there with a garden hose or hopefully a fire hose reel. And even little things, there's just this nice little low one, probably about 500 millimeters, and it's a sitting platform. But it works really well, because if there was, as it's likely to be, blown up leaf litter against this wall, it's not going to continue through to the house, which is on the right. So the idea of planning and designing your garden to actually help with bushfire defense, it's very, very important. And we're starting to see landscape architects and landscape designers starting to be switched on to this, to design in defendable space that'll help protect the garden, but more particularly protect you and protect the house. I divert for just one moment. Where is it? I've got a number of publications here. Trying to find the right one. I can't find it when I want it, but the Victorian Country Fire Authority, if you look up CFA Victoria, they have by far the one and only best publication which talks about garden design and bushfire. It gives you the criteria, it gives typical ways of using this knowledge about bushfire and how they behave. It's a very, very useful publication, free on websites, CFA and Firewise Planting. So, water-wise, your council's already talked about that previously. You want to keep up the moisture levels because when things are green, they're not going to be, to use the jargon, cured, they're not going to burn as readily. And of course, there is some, but starting to get good information about what burns in terms of different types of plants. Certainly natives are created to burn, but what about our azaleas? What about our various hedges? What about our cold climate plants that are much more water succulent? They don't burn as readily. Yes, they can and will in extreme, but there's many and anecdotal evidence of, for example, a brush fence protecting property, cars and other things when they've had a suitable hedge planting with a high moisture level. So the CFA publication will tell you all about that if you want to take that a bit further and think about your garden. It's key. So, whole house protection. Ideal if you can do it and you can afford it. Obviously, it's not necessarily cheap. There is anecdotal stories in the last bushfires about the metal RFS shed down in a southern inland town where everything was lost and the 8 people from the RFS crew sheltered inside a tin shed. The only thing they had to protect them was a simple water spray system on the roof with the water running down the walls. And happily, they weren't cooked inside this tin shed as the temperatures otherwise could have done, killed them very readily. They are full of praise on even the simplest of water spray systems on roofs and walls being a fundamental thing in doing 2 things. One, obviously embers, they are put out by this spray of water. 2 is that it cools the materials down and continues to cool them down as the heat of the fire is really hitting the property. So I do advocate sprinklers. However, what I've said at the Royal Commission and I've said to Australian standards and elsewhere is the present Australian standard, AS 5414, is not a good one. I was part of that one in 2012, 2014. And unfortunately, at the time, there was a lack of research. There was not proof on how effective they were. And so the committee as a whole elected to be extremely cautious against my advice. And they say only suitable up to BAL 19. So you only get regulatory recognition or benefit up to BAL 19 at present. And that's not why you'd put one in. You would put one in because you are in an extreme situation in terms of bushfire risk. We know they work. The house top right survived the Marysville fire. It had a homemade system where it was a copper pipe under the gutter, and then it had very fine sprinkler head coming down to send a mist onto the glass, onto any gaps and cracks. And it worked. That property was saved when all the surrounding properties went. The one at the bottom right shows a different kind of sprinkler head, what's called a butterfly one. And that is again on the eave, and it throws water up as well as down as it spins like a Catherine wheel. So that style of one is the one I'm personally using and advocating in my projects. But otherwise, the easier thing to do, this is my own installation, a 3.5 horsepower diesel pump, fire pump, to a 8,000 litre water tank. I wish it was bigger, but I have several water tanks connected to make sure that if a fire comes through, I've probably got 20,000 litres I can call on. And a fire hose reel. So this is the minimum protection that you might be wanting. And that's probably a $4,000 or $5,000 investment, as well as the stored water capacity. Because you probably recognize that if and when there's a bushfire, everyone is turning on taps, hoses. There's every likelihood you'll run out of water, or it'll just be a dribble. There won't be standard water pressure. So you need water storage. Now, how much? Well, the more the better. Because if you're doing alterations, you have to, or new house, you've got to do with BASIX, the sustainable index. You have to connect stored water for your toilet and for your laundry tub, and maybe more. But the most recent water storage system I put in with sprinkler heads for a project early this year, when it was under construction, my client says, look, I'm BAL flame zone, we've done all the right things, but I want that extra level of protection. So at a cost of nearly $25,000, we've got the Rolls-Royce system, which has sprinkler heads of this nature all the way around the building on all 4 sides. It's got a 10 horsepower diesel pump with an electric start. It's got heat sensors, because you probably realize that the heat builds up, the clouds coming in, the smoke, you can't see, you don't know where the fire front is. But to these systems, they work on heat. So when the heat reaches a certain threshold, the sprinklers start to pulse. They start to pre-wet anything and everything, the house and what's around the house, depending which direction they're oriented. Then when the temperature goes up more, when the fire is really coming within, probably 100 meters, it goes full bore. And it then keeps running at full bore, depending on the setting, for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then reduces to keep pulsing. So anything that's burning in that area, still with embers coming through, it will expire. But in this example I'm giving you, it was going through 14,000 litres in an hour. So 14,000 litres, I had a 20,000 litre tank installed. 20,000 was going to be enough for this system, but not enough for that system and sprinklers. So we've got to keep it topped up again further. So bear in mind, diesel fire pump, maybe a fire hose reel if you or someone is capable of defending, but certainly the water spray systems, from the simple to the sophisticated, really do work. And Australian standards and other bodies are looking at totally rewriting the Australian standard with water spray systems, because happily there's a researcher at University of Wollongong who recently got his doctorate on exactly this point. The technology, the physics of water droplet size, what happens with certain winds, what happens when big droplets hit little droplets, how much power you need to drive the system. There are 9 different kinds of sprinkler head. What works better? So that research is now in, and so hopefully in the near future, but it might still take a year, we will get a much improved water spray system. In the meantime, don't be put off. Anything and everything done by a good bushfire specialist can make a huge difference if you want whole house protection. you've got the possibility of water storage and you have the finance to install it. It's one of the best things that can work, and particularly for isolated homes where perhaps it's one of the few things you can actually do. Okay, let's work our way around a house and look at what can happen. Here's the same house we're talking about under construction, Bowel Flame Zone, off to the right. And so we've got highly fire resistant materials. We have in the roof space here, we've got shutters that'll come down. We have a deck which is entirely non-combustible, and they're going to put storage underneath for the mower, but we're going to be enclosing it all in with tight fitting corrugated metal, and of course nothing combustible. This is so-called hardy deck, which is suitable for flame zone. So there is nothing to burn. So here there is a change of level, but if you can do slab on ground, obviously low profile, but anything and everything to do with bushfire, the lower the profile, the less the risk. So that's number one. But certainly the old idea of timber bearers and joists are almost gone. There's a number of different manufacturers from Lysarts, BHP onwards that do all of this work in metal and of course non-combustible, and it's all so reasonably economical because it's lightweight. It's actually thin sheet metal folded into beam shapes. So it's all increasingly standardized. So certainly if you happen to have a timber deck and you're looking at how to better protect it, well, the lowest 400 millimeters is deemed the most at-risk area. So if you can fill in with non-combustible down low, well done. If you can afford to replace the timbers on top, again, highly recommended if you can afford to do that. Non-combustible always helps, because there's been so many house lots lost just because simple things like the doormat on top of a timber deck. The doormat ignites because of the burning embers, a timber frame, front door, back door burns, the house gets lost. So non-combustible, low profile. If you're elevated, fill in below. Gaps and cracks, the other fundamental. The Australian standard now says no more than 2 millimeter maximum aperture, maximum opening anywhere. So if you've got a brick house or a brick veneer house, you've probably got weep holes. So if burning embers got in there, and not likely you've got a timber floor, the timber floor will be well ignited before you even realize. So if it comes to weep holes, there are several brands on the market where they have little metal slots that just push fit, that are holes and penetrations less than 2 millimeters to still keep air movement to fill that space. You can do your own, as long as you use bronze or stainless steel mesh. You can cut to size and very carefully, delicately push that in. So you're trying to stop embers starting a fire under the floor. Very important. Because yes, this is what typically happens. It's the lowest 400 millimeters. At the same time, what's happening at the top? Because not many people will go to this trouble of filling the gap. Most everyday building construction, you've got a horizontal line, then you've got a roof sheeting, whatever the profile, corrugated, flat deck, still with openings, more than 2 millimeters, obviously. Now, the standard way of looking at it has been to use one of these compressible fillers that push fit to fill the gap. But courtesy of doing this presentation, I thought, I'd better look into that a little bit more. I've got the standard ones myself, but I'm worried about how flammable are they? And I was right to be worried, because in the last few days, I found one manufacturer, the one that recommended by Lysarts, BHP, and a few others, available, I think, from Bunnings. They have one of those compressible fillers, polyethylene, but with a flame inhibitor, a BAL 40, tested and approved for BAL 40. So there's only one on the market that I know of. So if you're not going to do this, you need to make sure you have a bushfire resistant, flame resistant filler, not standard PE, but BAL 40 PE bushfire seals around your wall and roof junction. Important. Just one other small but real thing is we actually do need ventilation in roof space, just as these are deliberately providing ventilation. So in my own home, what I have done is use fly wire, metal fly wire, and I've cut it to shape, and I've just screwed it into the top of my timber frame deliberately, so there is still the air movement getting into the roof, but the gaps are less than 2 millimeters. So bronze, stainless steel can do it, or you can cut down roof gutter guard to suit. So that's the other way of maintaining roof ventilation or even underfloor ventilation, but still stop condensation problems. So you need to look carefully at what your personal situation is in terms of what form of construction do you have. So principle, seal gaps and cracks, different ways of achieving it depending on your house construction. I've already mentioned verandas and decks. So obviously combustibles underneath. If sparks got in underneath, as is highly likely, treated pine, not a good product. Toxic when burnt, toxic smoked, toxic residue. You don't want to be touching it these days, banned from more and more uses. But there's many a timber deck of this caliber. So in this instance, you should at least cover it in, this low part, but still allow a little bit of ventilation, as I said before. But you can use timber for lower BALs up to BAL 29. But again, it should be hardwoods. And again, which timber, which hardwood is known. Anyone in the industry should understand which timbers are highly flammable, such as this one, treated pine, and which ones aren't, which tend to be your dense, heavy Australian eucalypt hardwoods. They're inherently better up to BAL 29. Some you can use at higher BALs. Personally, I wouldn't take the chance. And increasingly, we're now getting prefabricated, readily available things like this set of steel steps, galvanized steel steps. So relatively inexpensive, obviously not going to burn, and will be there well after the fire front has passed through. This particular example, one of my projects, we've got modwood, which is guaranteed up to BAL 40. We've got the steel deck, steel steps, and before or after this photograph, we put a metal skirt from the floor, which is about 500 or 600 millimeters, up to the underside, set back. As an architect, I like to make it look very neat. So again, principles, look at it carefully for your own home, but certainly decks are very likely causes of ignitions, and particularly if you've got things stored underneath. Fascias, gutters, eaves, same sort of thing. One of my projects is a 30-year-old house, just standard brick veneer, with owners that are concerned about bushfire. In fact, the ones that were told they're BAL 68.5. So they've been retrofitting. Instead of the very thin fibro eaves, 4.5 millimeter, they now put corrugated metal over it, because at 4.5 millimeter, that will very quickly crack and fail in high wind. So covering the eaves of 20 or 30 years ago, non-combustible, easily done, worth doing. Similarly, most old houses, well, even old houses, 5-10-year-old, often will have a timber fascia or barge board. So again, you can buy off the shelf, you can buy metal color bond that fits neatly over your standard fascia or standard barge. Similarly here, they had timber cantilevered out through the brickwork, and they've wrapped flat metal sheet color bond and secured it to the timber. to make everything less flammable. As well as you can see, they've just been putting in a sprinkler spray system as well. So all these small but important things can be done by a home handyman, can be done by a tradie. It's up to you. But everything you do, whether it's high or low, certainly helps. And then there's new products on the market. So in here, this rain harvesting system is a plastic device that you push through, or sorry, metal device you push through to close off the downpipe. And then if you want, you can attach your hose so that the water stops from here and backflows into the gutter. Because unless you have those strips and BAL 40 strips to stop flame, if you've got burning material in the gutter, leaves and the like, the flame driven by wind will head up through any gaps and cracks into the roof space. There are so many fires started in that way. And again, if it starts, you don't know it's happened until it's too late to save the house. So these kind of devices are on the market, and you can close it off and fill the gutter to extinguish any burning embers. And the other small but real thing is, these days, most of us use 90mm plastic pipes, UPVC. Easy, they glue together, weld together. But of course, if great heat, they're going to melt and give way. So what I tend to do is put 100mm ColourBond sleeve over the 90mm plastic pipe. So the plastic pipe is doing the work. It's sealed, it's waterproof, it's going to last for many, many decades. But in terms of bushfire, well, it's covered from the worst of the extreme heat. And if you're trying to put in a sprinkler system and trying to recover water to keep the system active, I highly recommend doing that as a very practical thing to do to cover existing combustibles. And quite apart from these devices, you can actually buy at Bunnings or Mitre 10 plugs that if you're willing to get up on top of the eave when the fire's bearing down on you, not a good idea, particularly those of us of a particular age, high on ladders. There's been, unfortunately, too many accidents, but you can still buy cheap downpipe plugs, which is the other way of doing it, but you need to be competent and early on to stop your downpipes actually functioning as downpipes when the bushfire comes through. Of course, yes, roofs. Simple, low roof lines are always best. Avoid ember trapping. Trim overhanging trees. Look at this one, where they've got highly non-combustible walls. This timbercrete can withstand fire for 4 hours. But look at this, because they have beautiful trees overhanging, and look what's collecting, and look what will burn. Not good. So certainly in the last 20 years, we see this. We see standard flashings as distinct from cutting it in. Now again, labour costs being what they are, not many people are going to cut them in. I've been advocating for some while, some of the material manufacturers saying, can you please provide this kind of pre-cut flashing for the different common profiles, corrugated, clip lock, whichever you care to use. They still haven't got around to it because until recently they said, oh, it's only a small part of the market, not worth our while. Now I hope the recent bushfires become a wake-up call and manufacturers say, oh, perhaps we need to produce a suite of bushfire resistant products, because this means that the burning embers will get in underneath unless we've got our BAL 40 seal. This is better again, because not much is going to get past that. So also trim the overhanging trees. We don't want this. Roof penetrations, wall penetrations, key concern of bushfire regulators. Now this is my own roof. I live in a 1912 house and I rebuilt the chimneys actually. They don't work because I've got good central heating, but I've rebuilt it to keep the aesthetic of the old house and put the chimney pots on but they're capped off. They're capped off here and they're capped off in the house, because if I didn't cap them off properly, all the warmth in the house would carry it up the chimney and out. So for sustainability reasons, I'm not using wood fires normally. I've got one that works with an insert to make it more efficient. But if you're going to have any roof penetrations to do with fireplaces, if they're not working, cap them off to stop, first of all, heat loss inside, improve your energy efficiency, and to make sure burning embers aren't going to come down in. In walls, weatherboards, the little things that typically get forgotten. Is this plastic in your home? This is for flaps that open up. When my kitchen stove top exhaust fan opens up, they open up. Are they plastic or are they metal? Easy to change to metal for obvious reasons. And then again, back to any and every roof penetration. No longer plastic coming through. It's got to be metal if you look at regulations. It's got to have a capping or a cowl cover. Again, no more than 2 millimeter cover, penetration hole. And something relatively new in the market, this brand is Deck-Tite. They make the waterproof flashings commonly used on houses when pipes and conduits go through, but the orange ones are fire rated. The grey ones aren't. The grey ones will burn. And so if it burns around the edge, again, the burning embers, the heat melts, you're going to get things falling through into the roof space, into the cavity. So again, small but important. Every penetration, a fire-rated penetration cover, Deck-Tite, a metal penetration, and the cowl is covered over. Okay, so that's easily done. That needs to be done by a proper tradesman. Skylights, roof windows, I love them. They're sustainable. I put them in nearly every project. I have them in my house. Instead of a dark heritage house, I have these to give natural light, natural ventilation with highly efficient double glazing and toughened glass. Because when it comes to bushfire, toughened glass performs much better than any other kind. Toughened glass is heat quenched, so it can take extreme heat the way standard annealed glass can't, or even laminated glass can't. So toughened glass for all external walls and windows wherever possible. So if you had a plastic dome, as many people have, you know, last 20, 30 years, well, of course, plastic, it'll very quickly go. It'll very quickly melt. And again, you might have a metal shaft or not, but you don't want the opening into the roof space. So one brand, Velux, produces this kind of double glazing to fit to replace the plastic dome. A very good product with its own flashing kit. Just as the same product up to BAL 40, up to BAL 29, you can use the standard way of flashing, soft zinc. If you're up to BAL 40, then you have to do a full color bond or metal flashing. Not a big deal for any roofer or roof plumber, but they really work well. But again, it's replace plastic domes, always use toughened glass, and you can use roof windows up to BAL 40, and I highly recommend them. So this is retrofit house where they had 30 years old, standard aluminium or timber, some aluminium window frames, door frames. So they've put in bushfire shutters. They've even put a little sloping head to stop embers catching a light, because you'll see there's still remnants of where they had planting growing up the wall. So that's now been cut off, but they were concerned to make sure embers would not lodge in the corner, but would fall off. So when it comes to bushfire shutters, well, number one, let's say metal fly screen mesh, 2 millimeter, pretty standard. Again, bronze or stainless steel works best. Obviously, if it's over the opening portion in low BAL, up to BAL 29, well and good. But if you put it across all your window, that's going to give you some good protection. But for complete protection, there are now obviously a number of manufacturers of genuine BAL 40, BAL flame zone bushfire shutters. I'm meaning by this not the aluminium ones, which have been around for 20 or 30 years, because aluminium starts to distort and give way at only 550, 560 degrees. And the fire front might be 1,000 degrees if it's a very intense fire, could be more. So these ones are either in stainless steel, or there's now several brands, which is a fiberglass cover to stainless steel, always in a small head, and they have the heavy duty metal track running down the sides and across the bottom. So they will cost you between $1,000 and up to $2,000 a square meter. The expensive one is when they're small, electric control, they always have to have a manual override. Fundamental issue, are they open or closed when the fire comes through? My current project, $65,000 for these, and that's over the top of the glass and the windows. So think about it, excellent product. Two, to do with the very fine mesh, which makes for a smaller box. You might be able to hide it, as to think for a retrofit, where you're probably going to have to face mount it, much as this one has. So again, glass and openings are vulnerable. So fire shutters, preferably not aluminium. I'm heading to the last few slides, I'll let you know. Just running through external doors. So there is one brand, Power Hammer, which has actually had fully fire tested Balfour-Tin flame zone timber windows. The problem with this is that New South Wales RFS has permitted them now for windows, but are still not permitting them for doors, even though they passed the most onerous fire test. And this, unfortunately, is when different states and territories think they know better than the Australian national standard. So bear it in mind, there is a couple of brands which will do flame zone for windows and doors, but they're usually energy inefficient. So you've got a problem about energy versus bushfire. So look very carefully and do ask whoever you're talking to, because obviously industry has had to cope with changing regulations. Your supplier, your installer should know all about what works for BAL 29, BAL 40 or flame zone, and put you in the right direction. So as always, close fitting, weather seals. If there's glass, it's got to be BAL rated glass, and fire resisting front or back doors, your area of escape. I've already mentioned gutters, downpipes to some degree. What you don't want is this. It's a matter of active debate to what degree gutter guard works, but you can see this would fail, because when this catches a light, the flame is going to go straight under the corrugated roof and get straight into the roof cavity. This is a total failure if fire came through. So gutter guard, probably worth doing. And again, there's different brands, different ways of doing it. Have a good close look. And by the way, you'll notice the examples I'm showing you are metal roofs. I personally would not put in a tiled roof in higher extreme, because think about it, each tile would need to be tied down. When you've got higher extreme winds associated with bushfire, the tiles are going to move unless you've got them all tied down. And you're not going to be able to say, I've got no gaps and cracks. The tiled roofs rely on, these days, on sisolation, on metallic sarking behind for fire resistance. Personally, I wouldn't trust it myself. However, if you've got that kind of roof, again, do everything you can to seal it, to tie down the tiles, or if and when the time comes, higher extreme BAL, I'd be putting on metal roof of whatever profile you want with the closers, because certainly there's no risk generally except at the edges and where you've got joints and so on. It's inherently safer. Seals around garage doors, there's new requirements came into play, because obviously there's often big gaps, particularly the old ones. How do you stop then burning embers getting inside your garage and igniting things within the garage? So that's now regulated. When it comes to awnings, forget timber. use metal. This is one which is those adjustable louvers. There's at least half a dozen brands out there. They work very well to get sun in when you want it and to close it when the weather's inclement. I love them. Sheds and garages, if they're within 6 to 10 meters, they will contribute to the house bushfire risk. Obviously non-combustible, and in some cases you could, depending on your property, if you're putting one in, locate it and make it non-combustible, because that could protect the house or the garden or your water tank from the heat of the fire from the bushland behind. So look very carefully at your location of sheds and garages. Look, that's a whole series of different principles about dealing with bushfire to do with ember, the number one, dealing with radiant heat, and to deal with flame, as well as, to some degree, wind and smoke. But you guys are one of the lucky areas of Sydney, the only area of Sydney I know, where you can get bushfire-wise rebates. Your home ready check, your bushfire plan, your pre-approval. And so I'm no expert on that, but James and his crew at the sustainability section of the Ku-ring-gai Council are. So I'll pass on to James to talk about that before we come back to both of us to answer your various questions as I've run through for a good hour these issues, problems, ways of defending your home, and now we'll hear more about how you can get a financial push to make it actually happen, hopefully in the next few months. So I'll hand back to you, James. I'll stop share.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Nigel. That was a fascinating presentation and so much really good information there. And I hope, I'm sure actually everyone got a lot out of that, because you really went into some fantastic details all the way around the house, all the way from the top of the house down to the bottom. And that was just fantastic. It's getting me thinking about what I could do around my house, because I live in a bushfire prone area, not in bushfire prone land itself, but definitely within the ember zone. So there's many things which you've presented here tonight, which I can definitely apply to my house, because ember attack does cause a lot of houses to burn down. So as you mentioned, Nigel, Ku-ring-gai Council does have a few things we can do to help residents prepare for bushfires, especially looking at their homes. The first thing we have is a bushfire-wise rebate program. So before we get into our Q&A section, I'll quickly talk about this rebate program. So what I'll do is, again, I'll share my page, my screen. I'll show you the Bushfire Retrofit rebate page. One moment. Okay. So you should all be able to see my screen now. So this is the Ku-ring-gai Council's website, and you can come to this Bushfire-wise rebate page by typing Bushfire-wise rebates into the search bar at the top right of the Ku-ring-gai Council webpage, and it should take you very quickly to this page. Here it will go through, it will outline all the steps you need to go through in order to apply for a rebate. Now, I'll try and keep it very brief and sort of let you investigate this in detail in your own time. But the general overall process is that you go to the Climate-Wise Community's website, and some of you here might have already done this. But so you go to the Climate-Wise Community's website, which is a council-run webpage, and do steps 1 and 3 of the Ready Check tool. Okay, so step 1 is the location, which helps you identify your risk, and step 2 looks at your property, and that is and step 3 is a very comprehensive sort of steps process where you go through each element of your house and tick a box that relates to the element of your house that applies to you, and it is color coded and will tell you whether or not it's a vulnerability or a strength to bushfire or storm or heat wave or any other natural disaster we have. The next step is to make a bushfire plan. And we provide a link here to the New South Wales RFS webpage, which you can download a bushfire plan. And then you come to this webpage again, and click on the pre-approval application button underneath the how to apply. That's where you upload your step 3 of your bushfire of the Climate Wise Communities webpage, so RETROFIT, and you also upload the bushfire plan and provide details of what you propose to do. Okay, when the application comes in, I'll assess it. I'll have a chat to you about what you plan on doing, and then all things being well, I'll issue you a pre-approval number, and you can go on your merry way and do the retrofit work. When you complete the work, you then send through the invoices and evidence that you've completed the work, and I might do an inspection or do an inspection over Zoom to stay COVID safe, and then I can issue the rebate. Now, what can you claim? So we've recently increased the amount you can claim under this program to 25% of the total amount spent to a maximum of $1,000. It previously was 10%, but we changed it to 25% to make it easier for people doing smaller items around the house, help them achieve the maximum rebate of $1,000. Obviously, if you're doing big ticket items like fire shutters and windows, they can be very expensive. But we found that doing relatively inexpensive things around the house can provide, as Nigel discussed, a level of protection against bushfires. Also, depending on depending on the work you plan on doing, some retrofits might require a CDC or a DA application. So to help you overcome that small hump, we're offering 50% of the approval costs to a maximum of $1,000 or $500. And this rebate is offered to residents every 5 years. So what that means actually is that you can apply for this rebate once every 5 years. So, and again, without going into too much detail, these are the areas of the house which are covered, and you can look at that in your own time later on. So what else can we talk about? Yes, there's one important thing to talk about in relation to the rebate program, is that the retrofit rebates, the bushfire-wise rebates only cover retrofits that are not required as part of a DA or a CDC. Now, that might seem a bit confusing based on what I said, so I'll clarify things a little bit. So, for example, if you're building a brand new house or an extension, council requirements or conditions of consent will say that because you are in bushfire-prone land, you must do these things. So you would have to do these things regardless of whether or not a rebate is available. However, if you're doing a renovation of a house, if you have an existing house and you like it the way it is, but you just don't want it to burn down during a bushfire, well, then that's where this rebate will come and help you. So if you are doing a renovation, say, for example, you want to replace existing windows, the rebate can help. Or if you want to put in gutter guards, again, the rebate can help you there. And in instances where you need a DA or a CDC in order to make these retrofits, that's where rebates can also help in that regard. It's to aim to help residents go above and beyond what they already have, and does not apply to brand new builds in bushfire-prone lands, because regardless of this rebate, you would have to do that anyway. Okay, so that's the rebate page there. I'll quickly show you the Climate Wise Communities website. Now, as Nigel mentioned, this is a website that Council has been running for the past 2 years, and it is a fantastic resource and will help you plan your retrofit. So if you type in, to get to this website, you just type in climatewisecommunities.com.au, and it will come take you to this page. And then to do the ready check, you will simply scroll down and then click on the Start Your Ready Check button, the green button there. You scroll down, click Agree and Proceed, again, that green button. Yep. And then you'll add in your location. Let's say, for example, it's 33 Vale, which is a location we commonly use as an example. And as you can see here, it will show you what hazards affect your property. The colors red is bushfire-prone vegetation, yellow is bushfire-prone land, blue is flood-prone areas. So this property has a few hazards there. And then if you scroll down, you'll see the hazards that affect your property. It has everything other than exit issues. and storm and heat waves. Every property in Ku-ring-gai is affected by storm and heat wave. It's because it's not location specific, it just happens across the board. And you can have the option to save to PDF. Again, step 3 here, if you click the step 3, it will take you straight through to your property. Here you can scroll down. You don't necessarily need to do the mud map, but that's very handy. I recommend that you do that. If you scroll down, you see the 4 hazards, and of course, bushfire is what you're most interested in here. You click that, and it will expand, and then you can go through this section and tick the parts of your property that apply. For example, roof, you might have a roof with many re-entrant corners where embers can collect. So you tick that box. The color is red, meaning it's vulnerable to bushfire. If you were to click if you were to have a simple roof design, well, then you would simply tick that box and you will see that screen. So that tells you that it is a strength or it is resilient to bushfire. So I won't take up too much time by going through the whole thing. There's quite a lot there. So it does require a bit of investment and time. However, I'm sure everyone will agree that say 20 minutes of your time going through this will be well spent, especially if it helps you plan your retrofit. Okay, so I think that is all for what I was going to go through. So now I think we can go into the Q&A section now. So we already have a question here. So before I start thinking about retrofitting, is it worthwhile understanding what BAL rating for my property is? So Nigel, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, definitely. It's not the only or the final word, but it really helps focus the mind, focus the money on how severe your property is likely to be felt under a bushfire attack. Obviously, well, some councils will provide you with a BAL rating. Does Ku-ring-gai, James, do you happen to know?
Yeah, I think the process in Ku-ring-gai is that if you are doing a development, a renovation or a new build, you would have to get a consultant to visit your property and provide you with a BAL rating, right, which you would then submit to.
Yeah, okay, because different councils do it differently. There are, I don't know, 50 or 60 or more bushfire accredited consultants around Sydney, the greater Sydney area. And obviously for a fee, they can give you an official BAL rating, but more usefully, it's not just the number, it's what can you actually do. They should be well aware and be able to give you advice on the spot about your particular property and the most useful bushfire defensive things you can do. So yep, it's a good place to start. Not critical, not essential, but a good way to get into this whole field.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that. So any other questions? I think, Nigel, you've done such a great job that everyone's speechless. Oh, hold on, we do have another question. It just popped up there. Okay, this question is from Erica. We have a fireproof gutter guard around our house put in when we have renovated, but the gutter guards cannot stop jacaranda leaves getting into the gutters and blocking the downpipes. Is there a gutter guard product that can prevent this? The tree is in the neighbor's property.
Effectively, no, unfortunately. This is why the usefulness of gutter guards is being contested regularly, because they deal well with conventional leaves, particularly if you've got a decent roof pitch, but fine pine needles and things like that can often get caught. And also, of course, it's very hard or often impossible to then clean your gutters at a later date. There are techniques that I use, for example, which means that I carry the gutter past the end of the eave and then keep it open, so that instead of having a downpipe, I actually cascade water into a pit, into a receptacle, or in some cases into a chain. Some of you might have seen that in decades previously. So there are some ways that instead of sealing it off entirely, you can keep most of the leaves from running straight off, but you have to be more careful and do bespoke work to actually try and make it so it's cleanable, particularly if you've got very fine pine needles and the like that get through nearly every gutter guard.
Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Steve Cartland. Most houses in our area seem to have a tile roof, often greater than 40 years old. What are the steps to protect them?
Well, it's a common problem. Yep, I understand. Now it comes back to, are they concrete tiles or are they terracotta? Concrete tiles often will have failed or be highly absorbent. The finish will have gone by 30 or 40 years time. So you might need to consider the quality and what stage they're at of their predicted life. Certainly tiles generally, where they often break down, is the ridge capping and the like, where the mortar joint comes free and they need repointing, to use the jargon, with mortar. So number one, have a good look. Decide if in the near future that tiled roof is going to keep you going for another few decades, or if you reach the conclusion that really it's at the end of its life. I would always personally advise my clients, no, replace with a COLORBOND roof of whatever profile, or if you're more upmarket, you can use a zinc roof or something else. Certainly a metallic roof, not tiles, and not any of the other alternative materials, some of which are highly flammable, typically like the American imports that are still available on the Australian market, trying to look like a flat tile. Slates, of course, very expensive, but they, of course, if they're installed properly, are fitting very tightly on a roof. But that's obviously a very minority of properties. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nigel. We have a question about via the chat about cleaning sludge from gutters. I'll just quickly ask that everyone keeps their questions in the Q&A, because it's a bit confusing to have to go between the chat and Q&A. So anyway, the question is about clearing the sludge and decomposing veg matter from below the gutter guard. How can residents do that? I'd imagine, well, like a pressure hose,
not easily. Because gutter guards are usually firmly attached to the roof. And again, this is where there needs to be more innovation. As I tried to explain, I don't know how well I did, I would just have a gutter which extends past the end of the eave, and I'd keep the end open. So the downpipe might catch most of the water most of the time, but in a major downpour, some water would still cascade out the open end. But the point of that is that if you can get a high pressure water jet or even a hose, if you've got access from the other end, you can, perhaps every season, give it a powerful squirt along the gutter. And so whilst some of the water goes in the downpipe, most of the gunk is going to be thrown right out the end. You kind of get the hang of what I'm trying to explain?
Yes, I think so.
The easiest.
I think I've done that myself in another house before. Okay, we have a question from Viv. How much roughly would a bow flame zone roof cost per square meter? That sounds like a bit of a tricky question. My understanding is that COLORBOND would also require the eaves and fascias to be replaced. Is that right?
Obviously, I can't give you more than a very general indication. You can safely assume it would be twice the cost per square meter of a standard roofing. Could be more than that if you've got lots of tricky, windows and valleys and gutters and so on. But just as a broad generalization, twice the price. Now, obviously, tiled roofs are heavier by a long shot than metal roofs. And that's another small but real consideration when you're doing it. You can't go from a metal roof to tile, but there's no problem replacing a tiled roof with a metal roof of whatever kind. When it comes to the eave, the chances are that you're getting, for the first time, you're going to have to redo your gutters and downpipes 99% of the time. So you'd be taking off your gutters and downpipes usually, And that's the time to either replace the fascia, if you want to, for example, give up on painting, put a metal fascia even over your old, you know, corroded or whatever timber you've got. And yes, it's worth redoing all at the same time if you can possibly do so, because that's a way of maximizing your investment on bushfire safer construction, as well as obviously reducing maintenance and giving you much greater longevity.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have another question from I think Yvonne. So it's about finding a BAL consultant. So I think with that one, that should be very straight. I think general Google should provide the first steps to find a BAL consultant. But Nigel, would a good first step is to do, I think there's an association for fire practitioners, is that correct?
Yes, what's known FPAA, Fire Protection Association Australia, FPAA. So that's a organisation that regulates and accredits all kinds of consultants to do with fire, of which bushfire is one component. You know, if you're doing, next time you're doing a high rise and you want to check the sprinkler system, you'd go to FPAA. But the other thing, what you're looking for is what's known as a BPAD consultant, BPAD. That stands for the University Diploma, Graduate Diploma course at Western Sydney University. And that stands for Bushfire Planning and Design. So these are people that have done the accredited course. There's a graduate level and then a diploma level, and these are the ones that hung out their shingle as professional bushfire consultants. So if you go to FPAA, a whole subsection, or if you just put in BPAD, BPAD, your Google search engine or whichever one you choose will spring up a whole number, and there's quite a few on the North Shore.
Okay, so that if we replace, another question from Angela, if we replace our tiled roof with a colour bond, do we need to comply with BAL rating, i.e. insulation? So I think in that question is, does the insulation underneath the roof comply with BAL rating? So I'll just say that again. So if we replace our tiled roof with colour bond, do we need to comply with the BAL rating regarding the insulation, anything underneath the roof?
Okay, let me explain. Up to BAL 40, normal roofing, normal insulation is the only requirement for bushfire, apart from sealing the gaps and the cracks and eaves and ridge top. However, if you're flame zone, totally different. You've doubled your roofing costs. You have to do accredited construction where there are drawings in Australian Standard 3959, which shows the template for what should be done for both tiled roofs and for metal roofs. But of course, it assumes new construction. So you really can't normally get sisolation in under an existing roof and make it effective. Certainly, these days, the more insulation, the better, be it under the actual roofing itself, as well as across your ceiling space. So do maximize insulation. Up to BAL 40, no problem, just maximize. If you're flame zone, meaning you've got bush within probably 20, 30 meters, and or there's steep land within 20, 30 meters, then you are probably flame zone. You probably have to make a council application, and you'll have to do everything according to Australian Standard 3959, the standard template roofing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Nigel. And we have a question here from Yvonne. We have Aluva windows with laminated glass in aluminium frames. Presume this is a problem on all counts.
Yes, short answer. Okay, what you can do, depending on the glass and where the frame is in relationship to the thickness of the wall. The minimum would be to look at having a mesh, a fine mesh on the outside, so you can still open and close your louvers that you've got a mesh shield. Now, if you're a high bell, I would use CrimSafe or one of the similar products, which is a rigid stainless steel security mesh, which is 47% metal, 53% opening. But effectively what it does, it's rigid. And so you could, depending on your house construction, have it projecting out. So that would reduce the radiant heat by at least half on that glass. So again, the retrofit, without knowing the particulars, that would be well worth looking at, as distinct from changing the window entirely, which it would be far more expensive. Obviously, louver windows are great to control ventilation. We want them, but yes, they are vulnerable if you're in a very high bowel area.
Okay, great. That's a great question there. So I think that's all the questions. Oh, we have another one. Oh, that's a thank you. Oh, you're welcome, Yvonne. Thank you very much for that feedback. And thank you for everyone else who sent some very positive feedback in the chat and via the Q&A. So I think that's all the questions, unless there's others that, unless there's other people that want to ask a question. So I think we're doing pretty well there. So, well, I guess now, seeing as it's getting close to 8:15, I think I might wrap up the presentation. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Nigel on behalf of everyone in attendance for a wonderful presentation. And thank you for sharing all your wealth of knowledge with us and all your experience and all the insights you've had into construction in bushfire zones. And I'm sure everyone watching has got a lot out of tonight's presentation. And the more that people retrofit their homes, the safer everyone is as a whole. Because in what I view it like, I think it's herd immunity, because house-to-house ignition is a problem. So the more people who retrofit their houses and make their houses resilient to bushfire, the safer everyone is together, because then more people are less exposed to bushfire as a whole. And what I'll do is I'll leave you with some upcoming events from Ku-ring-gai's Loving Living Ku-ring-gai program. We have a sustainable fashion workshop on the 7th of October at 12 noon, a pollinator talk on the 13th of October at 10:30 a.m. That's with our very own Dr. Alex. And we have a backyard bird talk